questions for this modules 3.1. Ano ba yung survey at bakit ito ginagawa? At ano ang mga iba't ibang uri ng survey? Ano ang relasyon nito with the context of correlational research design, its steps, and what are some issues in conducting a survey? But before anything else, ano ba yung misconception pagdating doon sa survey? Kalimitan kasi sa atin, in fact, this is an issue when we were developing a reference for senior high school on research and daily life too. I was tasked to do a content editing of a particular book. Ayaw isama noong author yung survey as a research design because ang assumption ng author ay ito ay technique of collecting data. No? It's a technique of collecting data over than the fact that it is a design in itself. So yun po yung gusto ko sanang ipaliwanag ng maigi na the issue here is totoo po yan, no? Pagtatanungin tayo, paano mo ginawa ang pag-aaral mo? Ay, nag-survey lang ako, no? Meaning you simply deploy an instrument and then you gather data using that instrument. True. Others would refer to that as simply as a survey technique, no? When you use survey as a procedure to gather data. But there is more to survey in the first place, no? Like any other research designs, quantitative for that matter, survey is primarily purposed to come up with inferences, to estimate the population. That is why sampling is a very, very important component of your survey research designs. Because if sampling is poor, then how can you estimate the population? So yun yung gusto nating klaruhin dito. It is a misconception to say that survey is just but a technique, but rather survey is a research design whose techniques and procedures are adapted in other research designs. Okay? As a means of gathering their data. Okay? Pero again, ito po ay tunay na research design. Okay. So what is survey in general? Una, gumagawa ka ng survey dahil gusto mong malaman ang opinyon ng isang grupo. Hindi maliit na grupo, malaking grupo. No? You are interested in the opinions of a large group of people. But of course, because it is impossible for you to gather all of this information from this huge number of people, you do sampling. Okay? Now, survey is characterized as one collection of information from a group of samples to describe aspects or characteristics of a population. So you have to be very specific as to ano yung i-measure mo doon sa population. Kasi ang dami ng characteristics ng population na pwedeng tingnan. Pangalawa, major data collection technique is through asking questions. So sa pagtatanong. Now yung pagtatanong, pwedeng personal na tanungin, pwede din namang naka-instrument na siya. So again, we will go into detail for that matter later on. Now the information is gleaned from a sample. So, ang tinitingnan mo ay sample and then you would want to infer that to the population. Although, census is a form of survey. But in this case, it's the whole population that is being surveyed. Okay? And census is oftentimes conducted only, hindi siya ginagawa taon-taon because it is very expensive. Imagine when the government is doing census. They are doing census for over 100 million individuals in the country. So, basically, it's going to be expensive. Hindi kaya ng hamak na researcher gaya natin to do a particular census. Okay? Now, types of survey. Mayroong dalawang uri po ng survey. Cross-sectional and longitudinal surveys. Isa-isahin natin yan mamaya. Now, sa longitudinal survey, may tatlong klase. Trend, cohort, and panel study. Isa-isahin din po natin yan. Simulan natin sa cross-sectional. When we say cross-sectional survey, this pertains to the collection of information from a predetermined population. The collection is done in a single time frame. Meaning, isang beses ka lang nagpa-survey on a particular characteristics. Alright? Example, voters' party list preference in Eastern Visayas. So this is a survey that my firm and I was tasked to deliver during the last election. So we did a survey on voters' party list preference, and the population in Region 8 is quite huge. No? It's over, lumalampas din ng mga nearly 2 million in terms of voters' population. So that's the entire Region 8, more than 1 million voters. So because we have that number, we have to consider sampling, and because it was very urgent, we have to deploy over 100 data gatherers in the region, and because it is also a crucial survey, lalo na't mainit ng konti ang eleksyon dati, kailangan ng matapos sa isang araw. So we had a total of 100 respondents fielded. For these 100 respondents, isa sa kanila ay dapat mag-gather ng 11 hanggang sa 12 predetermined respondents, not just based on site mapping, but basically based on the voters list. No? So single, bawat tao ay hinahanap. Okay? So that is actually the strength of the survey if you're going to do it right. And because we were able to do it right, we were able to predict as to ilang seats ang makukuha ng bawat party list na tumatakbo. And for our client, we were able to predict exactly how many seats they are going to get. Okay, so that is how useful the survey in terms of its utility for that matter. Now, the longitudinal survey naman, kung ang cross-sectional ay ginawa sa isang pagkakataon lang, ang longitudinal survey ay gagawin mo sa paulit-ulit na panahon. So, from different points in time. So, that is what we meant by longitudinal survey. That is why we have to qualify it. Sino ba yung pinag-aaralan? Para makita natin anong klaseng longitudinal survey ito. So, here I am pulling a reference from SABE's publication in my contribution to the work of Antiman on research in daily life too. So this is exactly lifted from the reference. So the first one is trend study, and I've said and claimed that it is a collection of information from a sample whose members may change and are surveyed at different points in time. So collection of information from a sample whose members may change. So, pwedeng magbago, no? Pwedeng magbago as you try to collect the data repeatedly over a period of time. And I have cited here some example. 1, poverty and agriculture in the Philippines, trends in income, poverty, and distribution. So, posible kasing buong Pilipinas yung pag-aaral na ginawa ni Reyes, Tabuga, Asis, at Batu. Pero posibleng every year, ang sinample nila na agricultural site or areas in the Philippines, posibleng iba. No? Hindi posibleng nasa Calabarzon ngayon, posibleng nasa areas na ganito ngayon, so posibleng iba. Of course, it is stratified, so I would assume that in this particular study, there were representations from the different parts of the region. But even though in Region 8, for example, there are a lot of cities and municipalities, so posibleng isang area lang doon. Also, you have another example, poverty profile and poverty condition involving the agricultural sector. So, pinofile mo yung poverty, both in its condition, as well as in its condition, rather, from 1985 to 2009. So, again, that is an example of a trend study. And we emphasize that notice that the population of interest is consistent. Hindi nagbabago yung population mo. Okay? Sorry. Pero ang nagbabago dyan ay yung samples selected for the study. Kasi hindi kailangan pareho all the time. Kasi every year, nag-random ka. No? Okay. Now, let's proceed to cohort study. Ano naman yung cohort study? Yung cohort study, simulan natin sa paliwanagan. Ano ang ibig sabihin ng cohort? It is defined as a group of individuals or subjects sharing similar characteristics or experience. So, putting that in mind, you are now going to implement a cohort study And as you look into it, ang cohort study po looks into a particular population over time by taking different random samples at various points in time. The population conceptually remains the same, but the individuals also change. So, more or less similar to the trend study. May konti silang pagkapareho, no? But in this particular aspect, let's try to look at this as an example. College and career readiness of US high school graduates. Anong ginagawa dito? Yung cohort of high school graduates from 50 states in the US was studied from 2014 to 2015, 2 taon. The Scholastic Assessment Test or American College and Schools of High School was recorded sa 2 taon din. Pagkatapos niyan, anong ginawa? They are now being compared. So, basically, you are looking at high school graduates. So, yung high school graduates ng 2014, sinample. Yung high school graduates ng 2015, sinample. At tiningnan kung ano yung kanilang specific Scholastic Assessment Test at ACT scores. The last type is your panel study. Yung panel study, napakasimpleng ipaliwanag po nito. Sinusundan mo ang pareho, eksaktong grupo ng mga tao. So for example, gusto mong tingnan yung resulta ng K-12 education. So pwede mong tingnan, sundan yung isang klase, first batch of K-12 education. Lahat ito, no? Sa, let's say, in Leyte National High School. Lahat na nag-first batch in 2011-2012 ng grade 7. Tingnan ko ang performance nila. The same batch, the same group, eksakto, pareho. Next year, nung nag-second year sila, tingnan ko rin. Nung third year, tingnan ko rin. So, sinusundan mo sila. Of course, the greatest issue there is mortality. Kasi, posibleng hindi yan magtatapos lahat, no? But then again, the keyword to panel study is that you follow or you gather data from the same group of respondents. Exactly the same group of respondents over a period of time. And this is considered as one of the best survey design kasi nga, you have controls on characteristics eh. Bakit ka may controls on characteristics? Eh, pareho. And when you do comparison here, no? When you do comparison here, you can do repeated measures of t-test. Every year, pwede kang mag-repeated measures of t-test dito para i-pair mo talaga yung samples mo. Yun yung isa sa kagandahan. Of course, in other studies, ang ginagawa nila dito, they would consider using a comparison na hindi makikita mo yung peculiarity ng subject. No? But if I will be asked, I will do repeated measures of paired sample t-tests. Okay? Or if I'm going to use analysis of variance, I'm going to consider the student as a block so that each student in itself will be factored in as it progresses. So, yung i-compare ko yung performance ko sa sarili ko over a period of time. Okay? And we would like to know whether this observed performance akin, whether it is increasing, is it also increasing doon sa ibang estudyante. Okay? That's quite interesting. Now, relationship between survey research and correlational research. Itong simbolong ito mayroong magnifying lens. So, ang punto lang dito po ay ganito. Yung survey research, okay, ay pwedeng gamitan ng correlational research. Ano ibig sabihin ko doon? Yung data nyo po sa survey, pwede nyo kunan o i-test ng relationship o kaya ng association. Okay? So, kaya pwedeng ma-apply yung correlational research doon sa survey research. And this explains why a lot of you have identified our example on correlational studies to follow a cross-sectional survey. Kasi totoo yun. It was a cross-sectional survey that was conducted, but apart from the cross-sectional survey, hindi lang nila dinescribe at hindi sila lang nag-infer doon sa population, but also they tested for the relationship of the variables. So having that component in the analysis, in the hypothesis testing, also qualifies such study as a correlational research. Okay. Now, what are the steps in conducting survey research designs? The first step is to define the problem. And I would like to ruminate on this very carefully. First, your problem has to be interesting. Why is it interesting? May connection po yan dito. Kasi pag hindi yan interesting, ay, itatapon lang yan ng respondent mo. Lalo na pag mailed, yung questionnaire, hindi yan papansinin. Hindi yan papansinin. When the objective of the study is not defined, hindi yan papansinin. That is very important to communicate to your subjects, to your respondents on the importance of the study and how their participation to that study would contribute in its significance. Okay? Then, it should not be trivial in the first place. What do you mean by not trivial? Dapat klaro yung tanong. Ang hirap kasi minsan, may mga questionnaires na pati kayo habang nagbabasa, na-confuse kayo. Ano pa itong sinasabi niya? Bakit may ganitong issue? No? Bakit hindi ko makita-kita yung gusto niyang kunin? Right? And then you use hierarchical in approach. What do we mean by hierarchical in approach? You begin with large categories before you go into the specifics. Okay? So, quoting Frankel and Wallen, a hierarchical set of research questions can suggest more specific issues within each category and conceive of possible questions. So, ibig sabihin, you start with a larger question, then you try to dissect it with smaller questions. Or, if you have an instrument and your instrument has something to do with perception or attitude to a particular construct, to a particular phenomenon, then pwede mong himayin ano yung konsepto ng attitude. Mayroon ba itong specific components? And ask the questions by components so that it would be hierarchical in approach and yung thinking, yung line of reasoning, at saka yung string of thought ng sumasagot ay hindi masyadong komplikado. And of course, it should not cause respondents fatigue. No. The problem here is that masyadong malaki yung survey, yung tanungan. Nag-survey ka 10 pages yung questionnaire mo, eh hindi na yan sasagot. When we did the voters, the party list preference survey, ang tanong lang ay, sinong ibubuto mong party list? Okay. Bakit? Okay. Yun lang yung tanong. That simple question. Of course, we record ano yung demographics ni ate, ilang taon na si ate, just to look at whether there is a variation on the voters' trend. But the point there is, the questions, the problem is very specific. Sino ang ibubuto mo? Bakit mo siya ibubuto? Nilagyan kasi namin ng konting qualitative part. It's a very interesting finding. Okay, so after you've defined the problem, you're now going to identify saan mo ito gagawin. Identify the target population. Why is it necessary to identify the target population? Because you're going to do sampling. It is necessary for you to determine ano ba yung population nito. 1,300,000. Dapat klaro mo yan. Kasi pag hindi mo yung klaro, paano mo i-determine yung sample? Although there are other procedures and formulas that are anchored on infinite samples or infinite population assumptions, it would always still be better if you know the population because it's easier to estimate. It's easier to estimate kung alam mo yung population ng study. Okay? The next step, choosing the mode of data collection. Okay, so paano mo i-gather yung data? Una, ito, I group it into 2. Data gatherer mediated, meaning may taong nag-gather. No? Ito naman, mail surveys. Siyempre, mail surveys, wala na yung laman. No? So, you just simply mail the survey. Ito yung problematic. This is problematic because hindi lahat yan babalik. At you will end up na mas magastos pa kasi sayang lang ang padala, wala namang bumalik. So, the data gatherer mediated on the other hand is where there is direct administration. What is direct administration? Pumasok ka sa isang conference hall kasi sila yung iso-survey mo. Ngayon, lahat sila or ginather mo yung respondents mo sa isang conference hall tapos pinasagutan mo sa kanila all together. So, it is a direct administration. Okay? Phone patch, nagtawag ka. No? Nag-identify ka doon sa ito ay napakalumang pamamaraan, no? And I always remember this. This was taught to me when I was in high school. Tinitingnan namin yung phone book, no? Uso kasi nung dati yung landline. So, pina-survey kami in our research to, I think when I was in 4th year high school then. Research to, kasi we have 2 research at the time. Research 1 in 3rd year and research 2 in 4th year. So, sa research 2 namin, ang pinagawa sa amin, kumuha lang kami ng phone book, no? Tapos, nag-sample kami doon sa listahan ng isang town sa phone book kung sino yung tatawagan at tatanungin. That was a very interesting way na how you're going to do it. Okay? And then, lastly, personal interview. So, harapan, face-to-face, tinatanong mo siya. Na kung ako ang tatanungin, sir, ano ba ang maganda na aspeto dito? Okay sana si direct administration, pero minsan kasi ngayon sa bawat pag-gather may pakain eh. So, baka mahirapan tayo ng konti dyan. Sa personal interviews for me, this is one thing that is good. Ang problema sa phone patch, kasi nga, hindi mo alam kung sumasagot, nagpapanggap nga si person A. No? So, that is an issue. But in the personal interview, mas maganda kasi nandoon ka, no? In fact, ito yung ina-advocate ko minsan kasi pag magbibigay ka lang ng questionnaire tapos papasagutan mo, wala ka dyan nakatingin, minsan hindi kuha ng respondent. So, when we train our interviewers, we're just giving them an answer sheet, no? Tapos mula sa answer sheet na yon, si data gatherer ang nag-fill out. Tapos doon sa part ng respondent, si respondent ngayon yung nagbabasa ng instrument. Okay? Tapos, it's very clear. So, kung mayroong tanungan at hindi naintindihan yung tanong, mabilisang na ipapaliwanag. Well, a variation of phone patch in this day and age of technological advancement ay pumapasok din yung ating tinatawag na Skype interviews, Zoom interviews. So, use technology-mediated interviews, no? Phone patch or other interviews conducted online. Okay? Now, selecting the sample. Ito yung pinaka-importante. First, dalawang bagay. Random, based on a selection criteria. So, itong based on a selection criteria, very specific yung problem mo. So, ang focus mo talaga, itong grupo lang na ito. So, may criteria na sinusunod. Itong random, ito yung kalimitang ginagamit, particularly when you are doing estimation. So, dapat random selection talaga. So, I would like to share with you later, no? Later na lang sa Q&A. I-share ko sa inyo, i-remind niyo po ako ha. I-share ko sa inyo paano gumawa ng random, paano mag-determine ng sample online. No? Ang dami kasi pong online calculator na napakagandang gamitin at yun din po yung ginamit namin. At saka, mabilis at predetermined yung confidence intervals mo. So, because your confidence intervals are predetermined, it is easy to navigate as to what would be the boundaries of your conclusions or your inferences. So, if it's plus and minus 3, then it's very clear. Ito lang yung range ko. So, I will try to showcase to you later on that one. No? So, random selection is one of the key ways in selecting samples in a survey research. So, then we also have preparing the instrument. Ano ba yung mga klase ng instrument na ginagamit sa survey research? Una, pwedeng open-ended questions. Pangalawa, pwedeng close-ended questions. Na may mga characteristics po ito. No? Ang open-ended questions, hindi po characteristics ang nilagay ko, but rather its advantages. It's easier to construct, pwede ka makapag-follow-up questions, and so on and so forth. However, may issue po ito. Anong issue dito? Questions and response is subject to misinterpretation. Another issue, difficult to tabulate and synthesize. May generate inconsistent response. So, ito yung mga issues na magiging problematic. So, kung gusto mo survey na scanning lang, wag kang mag-open-ended questions. Pero kung gusto mong survey and you would want to know, to look deeper into the phenomenon, then gawin mo siya. No? Pero pag hindi naman, you don't have to do it. Itong sinasabing difficult to tabulate and synthesize, I would disagree with this. But this was from Frankel and Wallen, sabi niya difficult daw. But with the current day and age and technology, it's much easier. No? It's much easier. Now, close-ended questions naman, ano po ito? Ito po yung may mga tanong at may sagot na mamimili ka na lang doon sa sagot. So because mamimili ka na lang doon sa sagot, dapat ang tanong ay firstly focused. Hindi pwedeng maraming construct ang minimeasure sa isang tanong. Hindi pwedeng double-barreled yan. Dapat klarado. Hindi po yan pwedeng ambiguous yung tanong. It should not also be leading. It should not be biased. It should use a common language. Hindi pwedeng technical masyado. At saka it should be brief. No? Outright yung pagtatanungan. Now, important component for this is itong dalawa po na ito ay dapat must undergo validity testing before it is fielded for the actual data gathering. And after the validity testing, it has to be pre-tested so that you would be able to determine the reliability. Okay? The reliability. Apart from that, nilagay ko itong response process because this is the form of analysis or lens to look at whether the open-ended questions, the questions that you use in the open-ended questions, generate the actual or the necessary response that you thought it should generate. Okay? So, pagdating sa pre-testing, nagkakaroon ng preliminary analysis on the response process. Tinitingnan po yan para makita natin. If you want to know more on the response process, you can actually look into the works of Four and Bacharach. It's on psychometrics, no? Introduction, psychometrics and introduction. Yes, I think that's the title. Psychometrics and introduction. So again, ito po mga issue na ito. Itong response process na ito, ginagamit namin ito sa kasalukuyan, particularly for our clients who are seeking validation of instruments on grounded theory, phenomenology, and even on case studies. So nagkakaroon ng response process. Ina-analyze ulit at tinitingnan yung sagot kung tama ba. Of course, the phase validity, just how the instrument looks like. The content validity is more of yung laman, no? Kung is it relevant, is it appropriate, and so on and so forth. You can look into Pulit for this, for content validity. Okay? Naku, marami-rami pa. Now, steps in survey research, preparing the cover letter. So, dapat gumawa po kayo ng cover letter na magpapaliwanag ng purpose at mag-i-explicate ng confidentiality clause. At importante pong i-train nyo yung interviewers. Lalo na po pag hindi kayo yung nag-i-interview. So, importanteng magkaroon ng training for purposes of standardization. Alright, now issues in conducting survey. Response rate. Bakit naging issue? Issue po ito saan? Issue ito sa mail. No, when you do mail surveys, issue po ito. Bakit? Kasi hindi nga lahat bumabalik. Pag hindi lahat, ang buong questionnaire ay hindi bumalik, tawag doon total non-response. Yung buong questionnaire, hindi talaga niya sinagutan, no? Total non-response. Pero minsan, pag mayroong nagbalik ng questionnaire, pero mayroong tanong doon, hindi sinagutan, yung isang tanong o dalawang tanong, ang tawag doon, partial non-response or item-specific no-response. So, again, ito po ay isang bagay na dapat nating bantayan, no? That is why we discourage mail surveys these days. Now, internal validity threats. Issues in internal validity threats includes mortality, instrumentation, and instrument decay. Now, bakit may mortality? No? Iisa lang naman. Oy, hindi naman iisa. Kasi minsan, pag may longitudinal ka, nagkakaroon ng issue ng mortality. Pero pag cross-sectional, wala pong issue ito. Instrument decay, ganun din po when you're doing longitudinal. No? At saka, when in the first place, even though in cross-sectional designs, pumapasok ang instrument decay, minsan, pag hindi na-train ng maayos yung interviewers, meaning iba-iba yung interpretasyon na nag-i-interview. Kaya ang lumabas, iba-iba din yung result. So, yun yung issue dyan. Instrumentation, of course, on the aspect of development and validity of the instruments, its reliability to produce the necessary results. And then, location. Bakit nagkakaroon ng location? Kasi minsan, hindi naman lahat ng kaya nga dapat klaro sa iyo dapat klaro sa iyo kung saan yung population mo. Kasi pag hindi yun klaro sa iyo tapos ilipat mo lang agad doon sa ibang lokasyon, issue talaga yun, no? Issue talaga yun. Now, estimation, this have something to do with how your variables could actually, or your findings could predict, could infer the population. So pag sinabi mo, oy, mananalo si party list na ganito, o estimation yan, paano mo yun ginawa? You only surveyed 1,300 individuals out of 1.8 million voters. Paano mo yun ginawa? Of course, that is where sampling and estimation comes in. That is why this is very important. Estimation becomes an issue when sampling is poor. Okay? So sampling is very important. All right. Now, as a summary to this, we've highlighted that survey is used when the researcher is interested in the opinions of the large group of people. It has several characteristics, and then this includes cross-sectional and longitudinal surveys. It is related to other types of research designs. There were very important steps and there were issues that we have to consider for that matter.